You don't even know how to speak English.
It's none of your business, but I master 3 languages.
You don't speak English, mocked the tourist. But the black saleswoman responded in 3 languages. Carmen Rodriguez stood behind the counter of her small souvenir shop in Copacabana, carefully arranging handcrafted jewelry from local artisans. The afternoon sun streamed through the shop windows, illuminating the colorful array of Brazilian crafts, postcards, and cultural items that filled every corner of her modest store. She had opened Treasures of Brazil 3 years ago with her life savings, determined to showcase the authentic beauty of her country to the millions of tourists who visited Rio de Janeiro each year. At 34 years old, Carmen was a striking woman with rich, dark skin, intelligent eyes, and a warm smile that had welcomed visitors from around the world. What most customers didn't realize was that behind her humble appearance as a small shop owner lay one of the most sophisticated linguistic minds they would ever encounter. The tourist who walked into her shop that Tuesday afternoon would learn this lesson in the most humiliating way possible. But his arrogance and prejudice would also become the catalyst for a moment that would forever change how Carmen saw her own potential and transform her from a struggling business owner into an international success story. This is the story of how a few words of mockery unleashed a linguistic tour de force that proved intelligence, education, and talent have no color, and that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the people we underestimate the most. If you value real stories of resilience and want to be part of a community that believes in the power of overcoming adversity, subscribe to the Resilience channel. Here, every story is a testament that it's possible to conquer any obstacle. Carmen had grown up in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, in a small house that her grandmother, Maria Rodriguez, had built with her own hands in the 1960s. Maria was a remarkable woman who had immigrated to Brazil from Spain as a young girl, carrying with her a deep love of language and learning that she would pass down to her granddaughter. Despite having only a 3rd-grade education, Maria spoke 4 languages fluently: Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French. She had learned them by working as a housekeeper for wealthy families from different countries, absorbing not just their languages but their customs, their literature, and their ways of thinking about the world. Mija, Maria would tell young Carmen, languages are not just words. They are keys that open doors to different worlds, different ways of understanding life. When you speak someone's language, you touch their heart. Carmen's mother, Isabel, worked as a hotel maid at one of the luxury resorts in Copacabana. She would come home exhausted from long days of cleaning rooms and serving wealthy guests, but she always made time to help Carmen with her homework and to share stories about the interesting people she met from around the world. "Today, I met a family from Japan," Isabel would say. "They were so polite, and their little girl drew me a picture of Mount Fuji. Language is a bridge, Carmen. Even when you don't speak the same words, kindness translates everything." From an early age, Carmen showed an extraordinary gift for languages. She absorbed Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian simply by listening to her grandmother's conversations with neighbors and friends. By the time she started school, she was already trilingual, though her teachers barely noticed this remarkable ability. In the underfunded public schools of her neighborhood, Carmen's linguistic talents were seen as interesting, but not particularly valuable. Her teachers focused on basic literacy and mathematics, and there were no programs for gifted students or language enrichment. But Carmen's curiosity about other cultures and languages continued to grow. When she was 12 years old, Carmen discovered the public library in downtown Rio. Every Saturday, she would take 2 buses to spend the day reading books, magazines, and newspapers in different languages. The librarian, Dr. Ana Santos, noticed the young girl who came every week to check out foreign language materials. "Carmen," Dr. Santos said one day, "I've been watching you read books in Italian and French. How did you learn these languages?" Carmen shrugged shyly. My grandmother taught me some, and the rest I just figured out by reading and listening. Dr. Santos was amazed. She had a PhD in linguistics from the University of São Paulo and recognized that Carmen possessed an exceptional natural ability for language acquisition. She began mentoring the young girl, introducing her to more sophisticated texts and helping her understand the grammatical structures that she had intuitive grasp. "Carmen," Dr. Santos told her, "you have a gift that appears maybe once in a generation. With proper education and opportunity, you could become a world-class linguist or translator." But proper education and opportunity were luxuries that Carmen's family couldn't afford. When she finished high school, she needed to work immediately to help support her mother and grandmother. The dream of university studies seemed impossible given their financial situation. Carmen's first job was as a tour guide for budget travel companies, leading groups of backpackers through the basic tourist sites of Rio. She discovered that her language abilities were incredibly valuable in this work, as she could communicate with visitors from many different countries in their native languages. Tourists were consistently amazed when Carmen would switch effortlessly from Portuguese to Spanish to Italian to French, depending on the nationality of the visitors in her group. Word spread among the backpacker community about the young guide who could speak to everyone in their own language, and Carmen began to build a reputation among international travelers. "How did you learn to speak so many languages?" tourists would ask her constantly. Carmen would smile and explain about her grandmother and her love of reading, but she could see the surprise in their eyes. They hadn't expected to encounter such sophisticated linguistic abilities in a young black woman from the favelas. As Carmen's reputation grew, she began attracting higher-paying tour groups and private clients. She used her earnings to enroll in evening classes at a community college, studying English, German, and Mandarin Chinese. Her language acquisition abilities remained extraordinary. She could achieve conversational fluency in a new language within 6 months of focused study. By the time she was 25, Carmen spoke 8 languages fluently: Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, English, German, Mandarin Chinese, and Japanese. She had also developed basic conversational abilities in Russian, Arabic, and Hindi. But despite her remarkable skills, she struggled to find employment opportunities that matched her abilities. Travel agencies and tour companies appreciated her language skills, but offered her only low-level positions with minimal advancement potential. When she applied for translator positions with international organizations, she was often told that she lacked the proper credentials or university degrees, despite demonstrating abilities that surpassed many formally trained linguists. "It's not enough to speak the languages," one personnel manager told her bluntly. "Our clients expect translators with university degrees and formal certification. You're very talented, but you don't have the right background for this level of work." Carmen began to realize that her exceptional abilities were being limited not by her skills, but by prejudices about who could be taken seriously as a professional linguist. Her appearance, her background, and her lack of formal credentials created barriers that her talent alone couldn't overcome. Frustrated by the limitations of working for others, Carmen decided to open her own business. She used her savings to lease a small space in Copacabana and created Treasures of Brazil, a shop that would showcase authentic Brazilian crafts while providing her with the opportunity to interact with international visitors on her own terms. The shop was modest but carefully curated. Carmen traveled throughout Brazil to find artisans creating traditional crafts, jewelry, and artwork that told the real story of Brazilian culture. She refused to sell mass-produced tourist trinkets, instead focusing on pieces that had genuine cultural significance and artistic value. Carmen's linguistic abilities became the secret weapon of her business. When German tourists entered her shop, she would greet them in perfect German and explain the cultural significance of each piece in their native language. French visitors were amazed when she could discuss the historical connections between Brazil and France in fluent French. Japanese tourists were delighted when she could explain Brazilian customs using Japanese cultural references they understood. But despite her remarkable abilities, many customers initially underestimated her. They would enter the shop expecting to encounter a typical souvenir vendor with limited education and basic language skills. The discovery that Carmen was highly educated and extraordinarily multilingual always came as a surprise. Most customers were delighted by this discovery. But occasionally, Carmen encountered visitors whose prejudices ran deeper than mere surprise. These customers seemed almost offended by the idea that a black Brazilian woman could possess such sophisticated abilities. The incident that would change everything happened on a busy Tuesday afternoon during Carnival season. Rio was packed with tourists from around the world, and Carmen's shop had been bustling with visitors all day. She had already conducted sales in Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, and Mandarin, switching languages seamlessly as customers from different countries browsed her merchandise. Late in the afternoon, 3 American tourists entered the shop. 2 middle-aged couples who were clearly wealthy based on their expensive clothing and accessories. They looked around the shop with the air of people who were accustomed to being catered to and having their preferences immediately understood. Carmen greeted them warmly in English. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Treasures of Brazil. Please let me know if you have any questions about our handcrafted items. Each piece has a unique story about Brazilian culture." The older of the 2 men, who appeared to be in his 60s with graying hair and an expensive watch, looked at Carmen with barely concealed irritation. "Do you have anyone here who speaks proper English? We're looking for high-quality souvenirs, not tourist junk, and we need someone who can explain the real value of these items." Carmen's English was flawless, with only the slightest accent that actually made it quite charming. She had been studying and practicing English for over a decade and had conversations with native speakers almost daily. But she could see from the man's expression that he had already decided she wasn't capable of the level of communication he expected. "I speak English fluently, sir," Carmen replied politely. "I'd be happy to explain the cultural significance and craftsmanship of any pieces that interest you. These items are all created by master artisans from different regions of Brazil." The man's wife, a woman with elaborate jewelry and a condescending smile, joined the conversation. "Sweetie, I'm sure you try your best, but we're looking for someone with real knowledge about Brazilian culture and art. Is there a manager or someone more qualified we could speak with?" Carmen felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, but she maintained her professional composure. "I am the owner of this shop, ma'am. I've personally visited each of the artisans who create these pieces, and I can provide detailed information about the cultural traditions and techniques involved in their creation." The second man, who had been browsing near the back of the shop, approached the counter with a carved wooden sculpture in his hands. "How much for this piece?" he asked, speaking very slowly and loudly, as if Carmen might have difficulty understanding him. "That sculpture is created by a master carver from the Amazon region," Carmen explained in normal conversational English. "It represents a jaguar spirit from indigenous mythology, and the artist uses traditional tools and techniques passed down through generations. The piece is priced at $400. The first man shook his head dismissively. "Look, miss, we don't have time for this language barrier issue. Is there someone else here who can actually communicate effectively? You clearly don't understand what we're looking for." Carmen's patience was beginning to wear thin, but she remained professional. "Sir, I understand perfectly what you're looking for. Perhaps if you could tell me more specifically about your interests, I could direct you to pieces that would appeal to you." The man's frustration was becoming more obvious. "This is exactly the problem," he said to his companions, speaking as if Carmen weren't standing right in front of them. "You come to these places expecting proper service, and they stick you with someone who barely speaks the language. Carmen felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Sir, I assure you that my English is quite adequate for discussing the cultural and artistic merits of these pieces. What specific type of Brazilian art or crafts are you most interested in?" The man turned back to Carmen with an expression of exaggerated patience. "Look, sweetheart, I'm sure you're trying your best, but you're clearly not understanding what we need. We want authentic, high-quality Brazilian art, not tourist trinkets. And we need someone who can explain the cultural significance in proper English, not broken tourist speak." Carmen's English was anything but broken, and all 4 tourists could understand her perfectly well. But she realized that this wasn't really about language at all. This was about their assumptions regarding who could be knowledgeable, professional, and articulate. The man's wife nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We're collectors, not typical tourists. We need someone with real expertise and proper communication skills." Carmen took a deep breath, recognizing that she had reached a crossroads. She could continue trying to serve these customers despite their obvious prejudice, or she could demonstrate exactly how wrong their assumptions were. The second man sealed her decision with his next comment. Looking directly at Carmen, he spoke with deliberate condescension. "You don't speak English well enough for this level of business? Maybe you should stick to selling postcards to backpackers." The words hung in the air like a slap. Carmen looked at the 4 tourists, all of whom were nodding in agreement with the assessment that she was linguistically inadequate. In that moment, she made a decision that would change not just this interaction, but the entire trajectory of her business. Carmen smiled calmly and replied in perfect, unaccented English, with the kind of vocabulary that suggested extensive education. "I apologize if my linguistic abilities have been insufficient for your requirements. Perhaps I can rectify this communication deficit by offering you a more comprehensive demonstration of my language capabilities." The tourists looked slightly puzzled by her suddenly elevated vocabulary. But Carmen was just getting started. She turned to the first man and continued in flawless French. "Monsieur, since you are clearly a sophisticated collector with refined tastes, perhaps you would prefer to discuss the cultural significance of these artifacts in French. I can explain the historical connections between Brazilian and French artistic traditions, or the influence of French Impressionism on contemporary Brazilian painters." The man's eyes widened in shock. His wife's mouth fell open as Carmen continued. "Or perhaps," Carmen said, switching to perfect German, "you would be more comfortable discussing the anthropological significance of indigenous Brazilian art in German. I studied the works of Franz Boas and other German ethnographers, and I can explain how their methodologies influenced modern understanding of Brazilian cultural diversity." The second man was staring at her in disbelief as Carmen seamlessly transitioned to Italian. "If you prefer, we could explore the connections between Brazilian and Italian artistic traditions in Italian. Many of our contemporary sculptors were influenced by Renaissance techniques, and I can explain the historical reasons for these cultural exchanges." Carmen paused, enjoying the stunned silence in her shop, before continuing in Mandarin Chinese. "Of course, if you're interested in understanding how Brazilian art is perceived and collected in international markets, I could explain the growing appreciation for Brazilian crafts among Chinese collectors, including recent sales and market." She switched to Japanese, or we could discuss the philosophical aspects of Brazilian indigenous art, comparing the spiritual elements to Japanese aesthetic principles such as wabi-sabi and mono no aware. The 4 tourists were now standing in complete shock, staring at Carmen as if they had just witnessed something impossible. Carmen wasn't finished. "And if you'd prefer to discuss the economic impact of artisan crafts on rural Brazilian communities," she continued in Russian, "I can explain the fair trade principles that guide my purchasing decisions and how they support sustainable development in indigenous communities." She paused again, switching back to English with a smile that was both professional and triumphant. But perhaps we should return to English, since that seems to be the only language you're comfortable with. Now, let me ask again, what specific aspects of Brazilian culture and art are you most interested in learning about? The shop was completely silent, except for the sound of traffic outside. The four tourists looked at each other, then back at Carmen, then at each other again, clearly struggling to process what they had just experienced. The first man, who had been most vocal about Carmen's supposed language limitations, was the first to find his voice. How many languages do you speak? Carmen's smile remained warm, but confident. I'm fluent in 8 languages and conversational in several others. I also hold certifications in translation and cultural interpretation, though I'm sure you understand that formal credentials are less important than actual ability. The man's wife stepped forward, her earlier condescension replaced by obvious embarrassment. Miss, I owe you a tremendous apology. We made assumptions that were completely unfair and frankly quite rude. Carmen nodded graciously. Apology accepted. It happens more often than you might think. Now, shall we discuss the pieces you're interested in? I promise you'll find that my knowledge of Brazilian culture is as comprehensive as my linguistic abilities. Have you ever faced situations where you had to prove your worth because of prejudices? Share in the comments how you overcame or are overcoming these challenges. Your story can inspire others. What happened next transformed Carmen's business and her life in ways she never could have anticipated. The four tourists, thoroughly humbled by their experience, spent the next 2 hours in her shop as Carmen provided them with the most comprehensive education about Brazilian art and culture they had ever received. Speaking fluently in whichever language seemed most appropriate for each topic, Carmen explained the historical, cultural and artistic significance of every piece they examined. She discussed the influence of African traditions on Brazilian art, the impact of Portuguese colonization on indigenous crafts, and the role of Italian and German immigration in shaping contemporary Brazilian artistic expression. This piece, she said, showing them an intricate ceramic work, represents a fusion of indigenous Amazonian techniques with Portuguese glazing methods introduced in the 16th century. The patterns tell a story from Tupi mythology, but the color palette reflects European influences. The tourists were fascinated and increasingly embarrassed by their initial behavior. They began asking sophisticated questions about cultural preservation, artistic authenticity, and the social impact of craft production on rural communities. Carmen answered every question with expert knowledge, switching languages when it helped clarify cultural concepts or historical connections. When she explained the spiritual significance of certain indigenous symbols, she drew parallels to similar concepts in Japanese Shintoism, speaking in Japanese to illustrate her points. When discussing the economic impact of craft exports, she cited statistics in German and French from European market research. By the end of their visit, the four tourists had purchased over $3,000 worth of carefully selected pieces, each accompanied by detailed documentation about its cultural significance and artistic value. But more importantly, they had become witnesses to an extraordinary demonstration of intelligence, education, and cultural expertise. Miss Rodriguez, the first man said as they prepared to leave, I want you to know that this has been one of the most educational and impressive experiences of our travels. Your knowledge is absolutely remarkable. His wife nodded emphatically. We travel extensively and visit galleries and museums around the world. We've rarely encountered someone with your level of expertise and cultural insight. The second man was equally effusive in his praise. Your linguistic abilities are extraordinary, but your understanding of Brazilian culture is what's truly impressive. You've changed how we think about this country's artistic heritage. Carmen thanked them graciously. But what happened next was even more significant than their praise. One of the women asked if she could record a brief video testimonial about her experience in Carmen's shop. "I want to share this with our friends and family," she explained. "Do people need to know about your shop and your incredible knowledge?" Carmen agreed, and the woman recorded a 5-minute video describing their experience, emphasizing both Carmen's linguistic abilities and her profound cultural expertise. She posted the video on her social media accounts that evening, and within hours it was being shared by travelers, art collectors, and cultural enthusiasts around the world. The video went viral within days. Carmen's demonstration of linguistic prowess and cultural knowledge captured the imagination of viewers who were amazed by her abilities and appalled by the initial prejudice she had faced. Comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination and praising Carmen's grace under pressure. "This woman is absolutely brilliant," read one typical comment. "The way she handled those rude tourists while educating them about Brazilian culture is incredible. I'm planning a trip to Rio just to visit her shop." Travel bloggers began featuring Carmen's shop in their articles about authentic cultural experiences in Rio. Art collectors started seeking her out, specifically for her expertise in Brazilian crafts and cultural artifacts. Universities and cultural organizations began inviting her to speak about Brazilian art and the importance of cultural preservation. Within 6 months, Treasures of Brazil had transformed from a small neighborhood shop into a destination that sophisticated travelers specifically sought out. Carmen had to expand to a larger location and hire additional staff to handle the increased business. But the most significant change was in Carmen herself. The viral video had made her realize that her linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge were not just useful skills for running a souvenir shop. They were extraordinary talents that could open doors to opportunities she had never imagined. Carmen began offering private cultural tours for high-end travelers, charging premium prices for personalized experiences that combined linguistic expertise with deep cultural insight. She developed partnerships with luxury hotels and travel agencies that specifically marketed her services to discerning international visitors. She also began writing articles about Brazilian culture for international travel and art publications, always writing in whatever language was most appropriate for each publication's audience. Her articles appeared in English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish publications, establishing her as a recognized expert on Brazilian cultural affairs. The success of her expanded business allowed Carmen to pursue formal education for the first time in her adult life. She enrolled in a graduate program in cultural anthropology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where her combination of practical experience and theoretical knowledge made her an exceptional student. Her professors were amazed by her ability to discuss cultural concepts in multiple languages and to draw connections between Brazilian culture and global artistic traditions. "Carmen brings a perspective to our program that we've never had before," said Dr. Maria Santos, her thesis advisor. "Her linguistic abilities allow her to access primary sources in multiple languages, and her practical experience gives her insights that purely academic students often lack." Carmen's master's thesis examined the role of language in preserving indigenous cultural traditions in Brazil. She conducted interviews in Portuguese, Spanish, and several indigenous languages, creating a comprehensive analysis of how linguistic diversity supports cultural preservation. The thesis was so impressive that it was published as a book and translated into several languages. The international recognition that followed her academic success opened even more opportunities. Carmen was invited to serve as a cultural consultant for international museums developing Brazilian art exhibitions. She began working with UNESCO on cultural preservation projects throughout Latin America. Government agencies and NGOs sought her expertise on issues related to indigenous rights and cultural heritage protection. 5 years after the incident with the American tourists, Dr. Carmen Rodriguez was a recognized international expert on Brazilian culture and indigenous rights. She had been featured in documentaries, had spoken at conferences around the world, and had become a powerful advocate for cultural preservation and linguistic diversity. Her shop had evolved into a cultural center that offered educational programs, hosted artist residencies, and served as a bridge between traditional Brazilian artisans and international markets. The space featured a library of books about Brazilian culture in multiple languages, and Carmen offered language classes for tourists who wanted to learn about Brazilian culture through its linguistic diversity. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came when she was invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Cultural Linguistics in Paris. Standing before an audience of linguists, anthropologists, and cultural scholars from around the world, Carmen spoke about the importance of recognizing expertise wherever it exists, regardless of formal credentials or social expectations. Too often, she said, speaking in flawless French to the international audience, we assume that knowledge and expertise must come with certain credentials or from certain backgrounds. But wisdom and understanding can develop anywhere that curiosity meets opportunity. She switched to English as she addressed the heart of her message. When those tourists walked into my shop 5 years ago, they couldn't imagine that a black woman from the favelas could possess the linguistic and cultural knowledge they were seeking. Their assumptions nearly caused them to miss out on exactly what they were looking for. Carmen paused, looking out at the diverse audience of scholars and researchers. How many times do we make similar assumptions? How many times do we overlook expertise because it doesn't look like what we expect? How many brilliant minds do we dismiss because they don't fit our preconceptions about who can be knowledgeable? She continued in Spanish, then German, then Italian, making the same point in multiple languages. True cultural understanding requires us to be open to learning from unexpected sources and to recognize that intelligence, wisdom, and expertise exist in every community and every culture. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes. Carmen's presentation became one of the most talked-about keynote addresses in the conference's history, and the video of her speech was viewed by millions of people around the world. The recognition from the academic community led to even more opportunities. Carmen was offered positions at several prestigious universities, but she chose to remain in Rio while accepting a part-time professorship that allowed her to continue her cultural work while contributing to academic research. She also established the Maria Rodriguez Foundation, named after her grandmother, which provided language education and cultural preservation support to young people from underserved communities. The foundation offered scholarships for language study, cultural exchange programs, and mentorship opportunities for young people who showed potential in linguistics or cultural studies. My grandmother taught me that languages are keys that open doors, Carmen explained at the foundation's inaugural event. Now, this foundation exists to make sure that every young person has access to those keys, regardless of their economic background or social circumstances. The foundation's programs quickly gained international recognition. Young people from around the world applied for the foundation's language immersion programs, which combined intensive language study with deep cultural education. Many of the program's graduates went on to pursue careers in international relations, cultural preservation, and linguistic research. Carmen's story became a case study in business schools and cultural studies programs, illustrating how personal resilience and cultural expertise could overcome prejudice and create opportunities for both individual success and broader social impact. The tourists who had originally dismissed her linguistic abilities became unlikely advocates for her work. They continued to visit her shop during their annual trips to Rio, bringing friends and family members to meet the remarkable woman who had so thoroughly educated them about their own prejudices. Carmen taught us more than just Brazilian culture, one of them explained in a later interview. She taught us to examine our own assumptions and to approach every encounter with openness rather than preconceptions. Today, Dr. Carmen Rodrigues is recognized as one of Brazil's leading cultural ambassadors and advocates for linguistic diversity. Her work has influenced cultural preservation policies throughout Latin America, and her research on the connections between language and cultural identity is cited by scholars around the world. Her shop, now expanded into a cultural complex called Tesouros do Brasil, serves as a model for how traditional crafts can be preserved and promoted in the modern global economy. The center employs over 50 people, including artisans, translators, cultural educators, and tour guides, all working to share the richness of Brazilian culture with visitors from around the world. Carmen's linguistic abilities, which once seemed like an interesting personal talent, have become the foundation for a career that bridges cultures, preserves traditions, and creates opportunities for cultural understanding across language barriers. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of her success is how it has opened doors for other young people from similar backgrounds. Carmen regularly receives letters and emails from students around the world who've been inspired by her story to pursue their own interests in languages and cultural studies. Dr. Rodrigues showed me that being multilingual is a superpower, wrote one young woman from Mexico who was accepted into a prestigious linguistics program. She proved that our backgrounds and our languages are strengths, not limitations. The woman who was once told she didn't speak English well enough for serious business now conducts business in 8 languages and has become an international authority on cultural communication. The shop owner, who was dismissed as linguistically inadequate, now advises governments and international organizations on language policy and cultural preservation. Carmen's story serves as a powerful reminder that expertise, intelligence, and valuable knowledge exist in every community, often in forms that don't match our traditional expectations. Her journey from underestimated shop owner to internationally recognized scholar demonstrates that when we remain open to unexpected sources of wisdom, we all benefit. The tourists who mocked her English that day learned something more valuable than they could have purchased in any shop. They learned that assumptions based on prejudice can cause us to miss extraordinary opportunities for learning and connection. And Carmen learned that her remarkable gifts were not just personal talents to be used in a small shop, but powerful tools for building bridges between cultures and creating understanding across the divides that too often separate us. From a small souvenir shop in Copacabana to international conferences and university lecture halls, Dr. Carmen Rodrigues has proven that linguistic brilliance, cultural wisdom, and professional excellence can emerge from any background and overcome any prejudice when combined with determination, grace, and an unwavering commitment to sharing knowledge with the world. The young woman who was told she couldn't communicate effectively now spends her life helping others communicate across cultural and linguistic boundaries. And every time she speaks to an international audience in their native language, she honors her grandmother's wisdom about languages being keys that open doors to different worlds.